So this is how my PhD started. I was really curious and wanted to understand why there was not much more done for the right to housing to be implemented and people to thrive in their communities, to thrive in their lives, because housing is really at the center of people's lives. So if you have a dysfunctional housing system, potentially you have health or unemployment or other type of issues. So solving the housing crisis should be priority number one.
Kia ora and welcome to the Homefulness Show. I'm your host, Zola Rose, located in Aotearoa, New Zealand. We believe housing can be a means for regenerative placemaking to create affordable and sustainable homes and neighborhoods. We'll be exploring different housing models and neighborhood designs and innovation in energy, water, waste, construction, land use, and food systems. We showcase housing policies, finance, funding, and community engagement to unlock this potential. This show aims to empower you with knowledge, resources, and networks to support you in creating great places to live. Come join us as we bring to life the more beautiful housing that we know is possible. Kia ora, Sophie. Welcome to the Homefulness Show, and I'm really excited to interview you today. So Sophie is a public works advisor at Toitu Te Whenua, which is Land Information New Zealand. She graduated in early 2024 with a PhD in law from the University of Canterbury. In her research, she examined how the affordability component of the right to housing could be achieved through collective housing. Prior to her PhD studies, Sophie worked as a lawyer for the banking and public sectors in Sweden. She is also passionate about languages and is fluent in French, Swedish, English, and German. Well, it's wonderful to have you in Aotearoa, Sophie. I think that we're very fortunate to have gotten your interest in collective housing and your skill with your background here in this country to help us to solve our housing problem. Yes, and that's why I've invited you for the interview, because I think your research holds some of the keys and very much in the direction where we need to be heading as a country with housing. So I thought I'd start with how we came to know each other. I believe we were both sitting on the Housing Innovation Society committee a couple years ago, which was us trying to create a sector for collective housing, really define it, and see how we could influence how our government is able to support with legislation and policy. And so the question I want to ask is, what was home like for you growing up, and what gave you that feeling of homefulness?
It's a very good question, because it made me reflect on my childhood and how I've experienced housing throughout all these years. And so I grew up in a very urban environment. I grew up in Paris. So you can imagine smaller apartments, very intense urban sprawl, and lots of noise, pollution. I mean, it goes with certain good aspects, of course, because you have access to culture, to diversity of people, and lots of positive aspects. But I think I was always longing for more nature, for a more peaceful environment. So as soon as I graduated from high school when I was 17, I moved to Germany. I moved to the outskirts of Berlin, to a middle-sized city called Potsdam, to start studying there, studying law. So I was longing, as I said, for more greenery, for a different kind of home. And there I found actually very affordable student housing, which I realize now is really great, both in terms of quality and price. It was run by the council itself. So you were just on the list and were allocated a very nice room in a small apartment that you shared with usually 1, 2 to maximum 3 students. And it was incredibly cheap. Now I realize, because I paid around 180 euros per month with all the utilities included, all the maintenance, everything, which is roughly around $280 per month, the equivalent of that. So I I didn't know my luck maybe at that time, but I really like the sense of community as well. It was not overly crowded. It was just a medium-sized housing, yeah, middle-sized buildings, which helped creating a community. And then we had some common rooms, and the city itself was great as well. Lots of public transportation, very small but cozy city center, and lots of green areas. So I was in my element. I felt quite at home, actually.
Nice.
And then after that, I lived there for a couple of years. And at the beginning of 2010, I moved to Sweden. And there I experienced also great housing. It was just a bit different. The quality was also great, really. Yeah, I realized it when I moved here, how the building standards were, how high they were. I experienced all the different types of markets there. So renting privately through the so-called second-hand market, owning my own place, and then renting through the council again, so more public. But then public housing has a different definition there and in Germany as well. So the private rentals were quite expensive. I lived in Stockholm for most of the time. The quality of accommodation was great, but there was not much cohesion as well between the tenants. So it was, yeah, quite isolating in some ways. I had great friends, but not much contact with my neighbors, which was a shame. And then I went on to rent from the public housing, council owned, which was a great experience because of the maintenance. Again, it was very affordable because of rent controls. And yeah, I enjoyed it. And then I owned my own place as well, which was also a great experience because at that time interest rates were quite low. So it didn't eat up that much of my income. I moved to Aotearoa at the beginning of 2018 when it was summer. And even if it was summer, I had a bit of a shock when I started to live here because of how cold the houses were. I think that was my first shock. And the fact that people were only heating one room out of the whole house, and there was no central heating. And it was the first time, I think, in my life where I started to think seriously about housing. And then I realized that there was a big insecurity around housing, that many people lived in short-term rentals and that they had no guarantee of being able to stay in these rentals for a long time, or even a guarantee about the rent, that the rent would remain at a certain level or within their means. And it was an awakening. I saw at the same time a documentary from Swiss TV about cooperative housing. And for me, it felt like two worlds apart. And spontaneously, I thought, oh, maybe this model could be interesting for New Zealand, because we have this dichotomy here where you have private home ownership, which is considered as the Kiwi dream. But in order to attain this private home ownership, you can be stuck in the private rental market for a very long time. And the private market is very precarious. So how do you reconcile creating communities, making sure people are happy within their current housing situation, this uncertainty around being able to afford to pay the rent, knowing how long you can stay in your rental, and then at the same time save for a deposit towards private home ownership? It was a big question for me, and I was surprised to see that more collective housing models were not so much widespread. There were already different stakeholders investigating options, but it didn't gain traction among the public or even among politicians and the local and central government. I found it rather odd because I came from the assumption that central and local government want to realize the right to housing, but
Mm-hmm.
still lots of people were stuck in this housing limbo
Mm-hmm.
where they could barely afford rental, let alone buy a
Mm-hmm.
house. But at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, they were supposed to go to work, to gain further education. Their children were also supposed to be part of a community, but yet there was nothing done really to help them achieve that.
Mm-hmm.
So this is how my PhD started. I was really curious and wanted to understand why there was not much more done for the right to housing to be implemented and people to thrive in their communities, thrive in their lives, because housing is really at the center of
Mm-hmm.
people's lives. So if you have a dysfunctional housing system, potentially you have other issues such as health or unemployment or other type of issues. So solving the housing crisis and the housing problem should be priority number one. Still, it
Absolutely.
isn't. So yeah.
Yes, I was seeing that as well in the organization I was working in Hamilton at Shama Ethnic Women's Trust. We were having a lot of women who were actually stuck in domestic violence or at least really uncomfortable relationships because they were not able to have another place to go, either with their children or on their own. And so I was seeing housing as sort of like a reason for that continued suffering of the women. And then I experienced that myself in my own relationship where I would have preferred to have separated, but really the housing with me, my two children, I knew was going to be a struggle. And sure enough, when the relationship did end, then it really did impact so much on the well-being of myself and my children. And I did even struggle to do my full-time hours while looking for another place because so many visits to all the different open houses right in the middle of the day on the other side of town. And I had to take off quite a lot of work to be able to go to these open homes. And so many people are applying, and I never got a positive response from any of them. So luckily, I had flexibility in my workplace, but others who don't have such flexibility, how are they even to be able to look for another place? Yeah, and then there's just too much competition. And then the houses I was seeing were such bad quality as well, not a place I wanted to raise my children. So all the things you talk about, I have experienced or been in an organization with other women experiencing. And that's just one aspect of our housing system, which is so broken and which has such negative consequences for other areas of our life. I kept hearing the word council in your sharing of the kind of housing that you had, which was affordable and even decent housing. And I think that's where you and I share a common interest, which is the fact that we believe that both central government as well as local government needs to have many more enabling factors where they do take more of a role in all of the kinds of housing, not just the struggling, surviving end, but all throughout the housing spectrum. And that's why we were in the Housing Innovation Society. And you were going into your research about that was the motivation that you had, this real calling, the sense of urgency around the right to housing, the human rights aspect of housing. And so now you finished your research, you published your PhD. You want to tell us about some of the key findings?
So first, if I can just backtrack a little bit into how I thought around which models to investigate and how just the whole methodology of my thesis. First, I realized, as I said a bit earlier, that there was so little research around it that my research would necessarily involve an empirical part, which eventuated into semi-structured interviews with a large number of different stakeholders, mainly either housing collectives themselves or local government, and I could interview not directly central government, indirectly through staff from the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, but they wouldn't talk in the name of their employer. Yeah, the central government was quite reluctant to participate. So that was interesting. Local government more interested because I think as well they're closer to the community, so they are more acutely aware of the needs and they see these resource and building consents as well. So they have a more practical approach to it and try to solve it in the area that they influence. And I was thinking as well, at the beginning, I wanted to investigate more European models of cooperative housing, such as in Switzerland or Austria, which is heavily dependent on local government. But then when I started talking with both my supervisors and then other people, friends or different people, they were quite skeptical about cooperative housing. And it was often associated with communes. You have probably heard it as well, that people make the parallel between cooperative housing and communes. And even accusing me of wanting to make New Zealand communist. I quoted from someone. So I've had different sort of reactions. I think this was the most negative reactions, but I also encountered more skepticism in general around, oh, this is so foreign to New Zealand. What is it exactly? We don't really understand it. We understand the dichotomy, private ownership and private rental, but this in-between model seems too complicated. And so I didn't want to frighten the public too much then, even if I had this ambition from the beginning to present more radical model, even if I don't like this word because I think it's very mainstream in many European countries. So in the end, what I did, I investigated how New Zealanders had tried to achieve collective housing, and then also the Australian model, because naturally New Zealand tends to look at the Tasman neighbour primarily for inspiration. I was quite positively surprised to see that in Australia, even if it remains a very minor part of the whole housing sector, cooperative housing has gained more traction and is more supported. And there is significant research around it, funded research even. So I naturally looked at the Australian model. And I had a number of findings in my research. First, it was around the narrative of housing in New Zealand, which we've talked about now, and that is preventing big change, I think, because in the mainstream discourse, especially from politicians, and we see it again now with the change of government, we talk about, still we glorify home ownership, private home ownership, whatever it takes. So you can be indebted to 50% now of your income, pay 50% of your income in interest rates, and it's seen as a normal sacrifice. Yeah, that's the latest data I saw. People, on average, people spend between 49 and 52%. And I'm not surprised. So it's still seen as a normal sacrifice. And again, we're hearing about deregulation. The market will solve the problem. We will build more, build higher, build smaller, and it will take prices down. But the problem is, my belief is that, and my findings especially show that you need more regulation rather than less, because you need the intervention of local government, especially because otherwise, if you leave it to the private market, of course, larger developers have big advantage compared to small cooperative projects in acquiring land and then building as well, because they build mainstream accommodation that council are comfortable with and that they have seen over and over again. Whereas smaller actors first don't have the same equity as larger developers to acquire land, and then they propose also housing designs that councils are unfamiliar with, which creates lots of barriers. So that was one of my findings, because without public intervention, smaller housing projects have very little chance to compete against larger actors who've been here for decades. Found as well that most housing collectives nowadays use the unit title structure to create as a legal structure for their collective, because many have tried to come up with other models, with self-made models, but this creates uncertainty for the members because, of course, it's not entrenched in law. So you're relying on agreements between the members, but then it's difficult to know how everything will play out down the road, and to envisage different scenarios and try to future-proof it is really difficult. And then it involves significant lawyer costs, long time consultation, compromise. And so many have ended up going with the unit title structure just to speed up the process, reduce the costs, and make it more attractive for the public.
I did want to ask a question about that unit title. So is that a tenure structure that does suit cooperative or co-housing or this collective way of people wanting to live and share more?
Partially, yes. But there are certain aspects that are not fit for collective housing, because collective housing mainly relies on compromise and making sure that all the members agree with the strategy and the plans of the collective. Whereas in the unit title structure, you only need a majority to pass a decision. And that was one of the main aspects that was quite controversial with cooperative housing, because the idea is to involve everyone and that everyone is satisfied with the values and the decision made by the collective. So that's one aspect that's quite negative.
Yeah, the social governance part. The other question I had was around perpetual affordability. So the community land trust model is wonderful in that it separates the land and the house. So that's the affordability piece. And then the perpetual piece is that the homeowner must always sell their house back to the land trust at an agreed upon increase that just matches the cost of living, so future families can afford it, rather than the market, which climbs much higher than the cost of living. So I was wondering, in the unit title model, is there a way to hold on to that affordability, or it just gets lost to the market?
No, it gets lost to the market. That's the main issue. It's one of its real downsides. And for example, Earth Song in Auckland has adopted this model, and they say they've had issues maintaining it because of that. Actually, because when people exit housing collective, it's usually to go to the mainstream market. And then that's a bit of a catch-22, because then they need to sell their house at a level that's enough to be able to move on to the next house. So it makes it very difficult. But just what you said before about maintaining affordability in land trusts, it's exactly like the Swiss cooperative model. You don't create wealth through your housing. It's just a way of making sure you have a stable, secure, and comfortable house.
I'd like to take a brief moment to share with you about Common Ground, the consulting agency to provide professional services to enable more affordable, socially connected, resilient, and climate-adaptive housing and neighborhood development and place-based living. So Common Ground works with local government, with community housing providers, with for-purpose developers, and with groups of people wishing to lead their own housing initiatives. We provide services in housing strategy, design and facilitation of meaningful community engagement, research, policy development, training in new approaches to better housing outcomes. We also provide services in workplace culture and communication to create more cohesive and effective working teams and workplaces. You can visit our website at commonground.net.nz to learn more about our services, and please sign up for our weekly newsletter for inspirational resources and get announcements to upcoming events.
But it's a mindset, and the problem is here the mindset is still set on the house prices increasing, so you increase your equity and you create your wealth through housing. So as long as there is this mindset, it will be very difficult to convince New Zealanders that other types of housing, which don't generate wealth, are also very valid and can create very stable and enjoyable communities and increase their well-being.
I know with the workshops that I've run, and I've done Women Revolutionizing Housing retreats where I've asked this question as, would you, if you had all these other wonderful parts to the neighborhood in your house, would you take a limited equity house where it has to be resold at a fixed rate? And I recently held a workshop here on cooperative living and asked the same question. And so many people actually went to the side of the spectrum that said, very happy to have limited equity, as long as I get these other benefits of security of tenure and the house is well done and I get along with my neighbors and all these other factors which add to my overall quality of life. So I think it's having these kinds of workshops where people can hear the other benefits, these community wealth benefits that offset this otherwise limited equity aspect of the housing.
Yeah, and I agree. But now it's almost become also a necessity for many people because they know that home ownership is out of reach, or they're very unlikely to ever own the house. So instead of having to shift from rental to rental and being very unsecure in their housing situation, then they much prefer having, even if it's not private ownership, it's still stable, as you say, creates a community. And so I think the mindset slowly is starting to shift, and especially among the younger generation as well. So it's encouraging that people start to understand the benefits of this type of housing, and that there is more and more awareness around it, and it gains visibility. So it's great. What the Housing Innovation Society is doing is really great as well. They've published interesting reports. Hopefully, it will finally gain traction, at least among a local government. I think Queenstown has been really good, for example, in promoting this type of housing. I mean, they have an acute housing situation, so they also had to do it. But the Community Housing Trust there is doing really a great job and innovating in this space, which is great, and lots of inhabitants start to appreciate really what they're offering. So that's enough. Unfortunately, they don't build fast enough and to satisfy everyone on the wait list, but it's really great.
I just did my last interview with a family who's received a home, and they're just overjoyed and speak so highly about the model itself and the benefits that they've received. I was wondering, in terms of the legislation, because your PhD is in law, and law is really what we've talked about is the crux of what would allow this model to be more prominent and easy and affordable. So what is it about the law that needs to change for cooperative housing to be able to be an accessible model?
We would need to either have a separate legislation or incorporate aspects of it into the existing. The problem is we haven't had any bills or anyone proposing anything around that. So it would really help develop cooperative housing if we would have a specific legislation, or at least provisions in the current regulations because then people would start to feel more safe or have more legal certainty around that, and it would gain more visibility as well. And so banks would be less reluctant to lend as well to this type of housing. And it would gain in legitimacy and become an accepted form of housing, whereas it's still seen as an outsider, as something a bit risky. And we would need to have a specific legislation around that, whether in form as a separate act or as incorporated into, for example, the unit title structure could have a specific about cooperative housing, and then it would really help with the other aspects, because at the moment banks are really reluctant when it comes to this type of project. And as I found out, many times housing collectives try to hide, but they tweak the wording of their projects, because as soon as the banks see collective or cooperative, they become a bit frightened. So they have to find, for the financial aspect, they need to polish the language. And it's really unfortunate that you almost have to hide your purpose just in order to obtain finance. And then that's why as well they go through the unit title structure, because it's a well-known and banks are usually comfortable with it. So that's why they have to dampen a bit the cooperative aspect just to obtain finance.
Yes, I've heard that story many times of having something that works for the residents and the bank, they don't understand it, and so they won't lend on it. I had a question about your PhD. Do you actually have in there the specific things that could a policy writer use your PhD to create the policy, or have you done that in the PhD paper itself?
I investigated different avenues of what could be changed. It could be especially around resource and building consent, and then the unit title structure. We should also start with the basics, which means incorporating the right to housing into domestic law. That could be a good starting point, because at the moment, it's not in New Zealand law, it's not considered as a human right. It's not legally enforceable, and New Zealand has international obligations in terms of the right to housing, but domestically not. It has been challenged through the courts, but the problem is it's very sporadic, and it perpetuates the idea that housing is not a right, it's something that you need to work for and not an entitlement. And I think that's one of the issues, because then it means that policies and legislation shifts a lot depending on the government of the day. I think to have a continuum long-term vision and really strong principles around housing, especially around affordability and security, then you need to really have a strong right to housing entrenched into domestic law. That would be, for me, the starting point, because then when you have this anchor, then all the other policies and the legislation derives directly from that, and then you have a clear direction for what you want to achieve, because otherwise it can shift. And we have seen the Residential Tenancies Act was amended back in 2020, and now it's been amended again, and which means that tenants don't have much certainty around their rights, and what can be granted at one point in a couple of years can completely change, and that's a major aspect of finding stability in your housing situation. So we need really a strong anchor, and the realization that this right to housing is paramount. It should be the priority.
Yeah, in 2020, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Adequate Housing released her report. Unfortunately, it was at the same time that COVID came to our country, and the government decided to give all its attention and its money to the COVID-related thing, which was fairly short-lived, rather than the right to housing, which was what her report was about, and doing anything about the recommendations of which there were many in that report. So I think along with what you're saying, it would be good to raise her report as well, in terms of all those points, and really create perhaps an advocacy campaign around getting those specific points in her report, because that is what you're saying is the foundational root. Everything else after that will be supporting that right to housing. So then your PhD, how would people get it? Would it be through you, or did you want me to make it as a link available through the podcast notes where they can just access it themselves?
It's available, publicly available on UC's website on the repository. I can send you the link. And yeah, you can make it available on your site, and I would be happy for people to read it.
We've already been using it. So as I mentioned, around this cooperative living theme, this movement that we've got at the top of the South where I'm living, that the first one was on general cooperative living and a policy that we have that allows for 3 or more houses in a rural area in the Tasman district to be able to come together and be settled without the rezoning or the subdivision, as long as it's held in cooperative ownership or use. But we realized that cooperative ownership and use was quite vague or broad, and for everybody to investigate that on their own would be time consuming or costly. So we invited a lawyer who's interested in the idea of cooperative living, collective housing, to pro bono give us a presentation on the various ways, avenues that cooperative use or ownership can be used in this case. And so I forwarded your PhD topic to him. He read it all, and he extracted some good things from it and used that as the basis of what he's going to be presenting. And I hope then that we're able to do this as a virtual as well, because I'm just hosting it live, because I think this is a really big piece to the puzzle, is this legal and making at least a template available for people to work from. So any group that wants has at least a foundational understanding of these cooperative avenues for ownership and use. So yes, it's gaining some momentum, and locally we're actually starting to workshop on these ideas. So thanks for adding.
Great to hear that can be of use, and hopefully I can contribute to creating some new collectives. That would be a great achievement.
Right. I'm not going to let your research just sit on a shelf. As much as possible, I will be using it as I forward this collective movement in my own area, at least. I'd love to be able to help to make it also a national thing. So I think you and I can keep teaming up on this.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah, it's nice to hear, because sometimes I must admit, during my PhD, during the time I've been writing, sometimes I had the times of discouragement when I saw that it wasn't gaining more traction. But there are people working in the background and really throughout Aotearoa, which is really heartening, to be honest. So I'm happy to hear that.
A few questions to wrap up. I'm interested in the kind of housing that you are in now, and if it's not your ideal housing, what you aspire to and how you plan to make that happen.
So at the moment, I'm in a very classic semi-detached house that we bought with my husband back in beginning of 2021 now. Yeah, so it's been 3 years and something. So in terms of private home ownership, I'm not very satisfied. I mean, to be honest, now it's quite expensive, especially with higher interest rates. And so I still have the idea of a more collaborative type of housing. I mean, I get along well with my neighbors, and we are in a very nice neighborhood. I'm really happy that we live so close to the center, that I can walk, bike, that it's easily accessible. So in these terms, and the size of the house, it's quite small, but I enjoy having a small place, to be honest. I'm used to it as well, coming from Europe. And so this aspect I like. And we have a little garden, which I would like maybe to be a bit bigger, to have a bit more greenery around me. I really enjoy it, looking at the trees and hearing the birds. So I love it. My neighborhood is nice, and I like the size of our house, but I don't think it's forever home. I would like still a bit more community spirit, because it's still pretty much each to their own. So it's a bit difficult to interact. even if they're nice neighbors, but I would long for something more. Sharing, for example, tools or the lawnmower, or doing carpooling, or exchanging childcare services, or I'm aspiring to something more connected than that. And at the moment in Christchurch, so there is the Peterborough Cooperative Housing, which I interviewed, and I really enjoyed it. It's just they have a long wait list as well. But this type of housing, I think, would suit us. And I like the fact that it's quite intergenerational. And you have a mix of situations. So you have people who are living by themselves, you have families, you have elderly, you have a mix of different type of people. And I like that. And people from different backgrounds. And I think this is what I miss, because where we are, it's still very individualistic and car-centric, even if we're so close to the city center. And it doesn't really suit me. I grew up with public transportation, basically. And for me, I miss that. I miss the fact to be able to take the bus or the tram and just not having the car. I like the semi-urban environment. And I think many housing collectives try to achieve that as well. There is a big variety. There are also rural ones there, but many try to be semi-rural, because then you're not as much dependent on the car, which I find great with Peterborough. They have tried to reduce the number of cars and encourage soft mobility with bikes and walking, and they're centrally located, which helps. But having here less cars, more life, green, more connection, social interaction, that would be great.
It would be wonderful if there were more Peterborough housing cooperatives. They've got a great model that does work and it looks beautiful. So hopefully some policy that supports that we can get some more of those developments for yourself and myself too. So just a few ending questions. Can you tell us a fun or obscure fact about yourself?
Oh, I used to do tap dancing.
I did too as a little kid. Oh, that's so great. We share that in common as well.
And once I was asked to do an improvisation. I did a student high school exchange with a high school in Austria. And they put me on the spot 10 minutes before they were supposed to have a little show. They said, "Oh, can you do a tap dancing demonstration?" I don't know how I did it, but I just did.
That is so much fun. Okay, another question. What's the most interesting home you've ever been in?
I must say I have a soft spot for wooden houses, for chalet type in the mountains, especially in Switzerland and Austria. I've always loved it since I was a child, and they are so well built, and they're so energy efficient and so cozy and so natural. I absolutely love wooden houses. So that's my type of house. And especially when you have the scenery around you, seeing the snow and the mountains, I just love it.
Well, then you'll love my house. I've got bamboo floors, wooden walls, and I have an amazing view. So I welcome you to come visit me.
Oh, nice. Oh, that sounds very tempting.
Good. All right. Invitation is sent. Okay. And how about any books that you're reading, whether it be on housing or something of that sort of nature? Do you recommend any books that you've enjoyed?
Recently, I read an Australian book about permaculture, housing, and how to be self-sufficient, basically. So that's a really interesting thing about how to maximize the resources we have without cluttering our houses, and just using what nature gives us to live simply but well.
That's right, because there's things we can do. Some people are a little bit stuck where they are currently. They can't just make this change to how they'd like to live otherwise. But I think with books like what you're reading or Retro Suburbia, I think just looking around and seeing what exists already and using those spaces or resources a little bit differently can achieve better results.
And I can recommend as well, of course, the book from Robin Allison, Co-Housing.
Of course.
That's a really good book. And then the one from Charles Durrett. It's a bit older, but it's a really good book as well, because it gives really practical examples. So that's a book that has inspired me as well.
And last but not least, any podcasts or YouTube channels on this topic that you would recommend people can check out to get more information?
I watched the tiny houses one. He's and he's traveling around both New Zealand and overseas to showcase different types of tiny houses. So his YouTube channel, and it's very nice because he shows really all around the world what people are doing, what type of tiny houses, and what are the positive sides, but also the downsides of it. And I enjoy the format.
And is there any podcast that you can recommend?
I have been listening, especially there was a series on the Swedish radio about the whole housing politics, like what has shaped the current housing market there, which I really liked because it was focused on well-being and welfare. So this was the premise of the housing strategy in Sweden, how to increase well-being and welfare among the population since the 1940s, 50s. And you can see how it has influenced the whole market. And it's quite interesting.
I've got one to recommend. It's called Co-op Conversations, Life in a Housing Cooperative. That's a great show.
It's like the one from the former rapporteur, Leilani Farah. She has also a channel where she talks with a Swedish movie maker. They did movies together, and especially one I can recommend. It's called Push, and it examines how the segregation is increasing, like in major cities like Toronto and major cities around the world, and the dynamics behind that from an economic perspective. So they interview economists and different researchers and even people who are experiencing these situations. So this I would recommend. And so his name is Fredrik Gerten with Leilani Farah. They have great conversations together.
Fantastic. I think the more people hear stories and hear from people who are benefiting by living in these places and hear the nuances of how these housing projects work, is we're just normalizing it through storytelling. And that's why I always do like to end on that note of podcast and YouTube channels, because it's that opportunity for us to imagine how it can be, because we're hearing it from others, and then we can have the will to work for the policy to make it happen for us here.
Exactly. The more it's visible, the better.
Well, it's been fantastic speaking with you today about our shared interests and about your wonderful research, which I'm going to be promoting. And I look forward to having you visit me and to having people access your PhD and hear what comes of it. Maybe other research will be able to build off of the research you've done. And I look forward to the first proper housing cooperative in this country. Let's say it's possible coming soon. Let's be hopeful.
Yeah. Oh, yes. I would be so happy to see the first proper cooperative being built.
I'm very optimistic.
Thank you very much, Sola, for having me on this podcast. And yeah, let's continue this conversation.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you so much, Sophie.
I published this episode at the end of March 2025. So if you're listening and you are in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I highly recommend that you attend the Aotearoa Collective Housing Conference, also known as the Koho Hui, brought to you by the Housing Innovation Society, going from the 15th to the 17th of April of this year, held at the Ara Institute of Canterbury, which is in Otatahi, Christchurch. There's going to be academic papers on the research that's been done on the future of housing with all kinds of creative topics. I'm going to be presenting a paper with Rabina McCurdy on participatory permaculture design for thriving neighborhoods. And I've just learned about another presentation on a tiny home village concept for Canterbury in Christchurch. So if you're interested to attend, where all the movers and shakers are going to be who've been leading the way in anything to do with collective housing in Aotearoa, then I suggest you go to kohohui.com. And if you're a member of the Housing Innovation Society, you get a discount. That is thehousinginnovationsociety.com to be a member. We're also going to have keynote speakers from Australia, the UK, and Europe. So this is not only going to be housing about Aotearoa. So from wherever you are, if you are in the country in April, highly recommend you come. I look forward to seeing you there.